Hi, my name is Madeline Farrell, and this is my cultural theories presentation. The theories I will be examining in this presentation are microaggression theory and spiral of silence theory. This presentation will highlight what each theory is, examples of each theory, how they impact marginalized groups, and how they connect to my future role as a professional counselor. The first theory I will be covering is microaggression theory. To start off, what are microaggressions? Microaggressions are subtle ways to discriminate against marginalized groups. This can be done in many different ways, not just verbal. And of course, since they are subtle, they often aren't intentional, but of course they can be. These can be done against, like I said, any marginalized groups such as women, members of the LGBTQ plus community, certain religious groups, ethnic groups, and so on. These are a few examples of verbal, behavioral, and environmental microaggressions. Although at first glance these may not seem harmful or they may seem unintentional, these microaggressions are rooted in assumptions and potential erasure of marginalized groups. So my future role is as a professional counselor, and of course microaggressions and microaggression theory can tie into that role and environment. Microaggressions can appear in many different ways in the counseling setting, both towards the client and counselor. Firstly, a counselor needs to be culturally competent and recognize their own biases as well as the individuality and uniqueness of their clients' experiences and perspectives. However, this does not mean that a counselor may not do or say something that could be perceived as a microaggression by the client. Similarly, a counselor can face microaggressions from supervisors, other colleagues, and even their clients if they fall into a minority or marginalized group. This is an example of a microaggression towards a client. In this example, a client who is transgender is expressing their feelings and struggles to a counselor. Instead of recognizing and being empathetic towards the client and their struggles, the counselor instead brushes off and invalidates the client's feelings and concerns which regard the marginalized group they are in and their identity. This, of course, further marginalizes the group and the individual, and of course could make the client uncomfortable, could ruin any sort of trust they had towards the counselor, and could potentially lead to premature termination of services. And here's an example of a microaggression towards a counselor. In this example, a white individual is meeting their counselor for the first time, and they notice that their counselor has darker skin and an accent. This leads to some assumptions from the client and leads them to question the counselor's qualifications and ability to properly counsel them. This, of course, can lead to anxiety and discomfort on the counselor's end and can overall be negative for the counselor-client relationship. Up next, I will be covering the spiral of silence theory. The spiral of silence theory refers to a communication model where the minority opinion gets drowned out by the majority opinion. Someone may be hesitant to share or refuse to share their opinion due to fear of standing out as the minority or being isolated from the majority. This could potentially lead to the minority opinion no longer being heard and eventually cause it to disappear from public discourse. This theory has many key elements. One of these is the fear of isolation, which leads people to not share their opinions if they perceive that they're in the minority. This can also be seen as people issuing threats of isolation, such as laughing at people or criticizing their opinions. Also, the majority opinion seems to be more amplified because people who feel that they are in the majority tend to share their opinion more fiercely. And lastly, the spiral of silence theory only seems to connect to controversial issues which have moral components. Here are a few examples where the spiral of silence theory can apply. These examples show that the spiral of silence theory can be present in many different places and many different roles. It can make employees feel unseen and unheard. It can lead to biases in journals, and it can even be seen present on social media where often opinions seem to be more equal. Once again, connecting this theory to my future role as a professional counselor, although not on a major scale or in society as a whole, the spiral of silence theory can still impact the counselor-client relationship or the counseling workplace. For instance, a client may feel that their opinion is in the minority and they may not share it with the counselor or communicate well with the counselor regarding that because they feel like they may be judged or ridiculed. Counseling is built off of trust and communication, so this could potentially hinder any sort of progress or communication between the counselor and the client. Similarly, when it comes to the workplace, and similar to the example from before, a counselor may feel that their opinion is in the minority compared to their colleagues, so they may not share it, and their voice will not be heard or their opinion will not be seen in the workplace compared to the majority opinion. So here's an example of how the spiral of silence theory can impact counseling and the client-counselor relationship. In this example, a client has political views that are tying in to their mental health struggles. However, due to perceiving those views as the minority and fearing being judged or ridiculed by the counselor, they keep these feelings and opinions to themselves. This, in turn, hinders communication and the counselor's ability to truly help the client, since the counselor does not know what is truly bothering the client or what is causing their mental health struggles, since the client will not openly express their opinions or their struggles. Here is another example of how the spiral of silence theory can impact counseling and specifically the counseling environment. This example is similar to one of the examples from before, where an employee feels that their opinion is the minority, so they don't speak up. In this specific example, a counselor is against restrictive policies that are being placed in their workplace. However, it seems that majority of their colleagues are in favor of these new policies, so since the counselor perceives their opinion as the minority, they keep it to themselves, and in turn their opinion is not heard or considered. In conclusion, it is clear that both microaggression theory and the spiral of silence theory have negative impacts on marginalized groups and individuals. However, it is also now clear that these two theories can also have negative impacts on counseling, the client-counselor relationship, and the counseling environment as a whole. And here are all of the references for the sources I used throughout this presentation. Thank you for watching.